Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction. This, for our purposes, also includes things like fairy tales, things like mythologies, things that we sometimes don't think of in the same category but really are, such as alternate histories. What calls this to mind is the fact that I shall be attending a science fiction convention over the next 3 days at the end of the week. It will be on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So, I'm thinking, when you look at our modern culture, it's obvious that the major studios are dying. And they're dying because people are losing interest. And it seems all they churn out are sequels and remakes and remixes of older things. For example, X-Men 97 has been introduced for Disney+. It is a continuation of the old 1997 X-Men series. Of course, Disney being the current owner of all things Marvel, and Disney being what it is today, people have called into question this project, thinking it will be yet another ruination of an old favorite that people fondly remember from their own youths. And they're probably right. They've already announced that one of the characters is being effectively redesigned as non-binary, one of those cool-sounding words that makes the modern liberal woke crowd very excited, but which seems to win nothing but scorn and opposition, not only from some far right-wing racists, but from basically everyone who's not woke. And more than likely, they'll be doing other things in the X-Men series that lean hard into the woke agenda, that lean hard into making changes. And it's very obvious that the studios know what people like, inasmuch as they know they like certain specific products that were made in the past, like X-Men from 1997, which was shown on Fox. But to them, the people like those things in a very superficial way. They like the look and design of the characters and the overall patterns of how the stories unfold. Often they don't really understand those stories, but they understand certain story beats and the general aesthetics of the world that they're in. They're basically thinking that people like the aesthetics, and they think they can just put whatever story or whatever meaning into it they want and refine it any way they want, so long as all the characters look the same and have the same aesthetic and have the same basic themes for the world, for want of a better term. But once you start changing the underlying characters in terms of their motivation and personality, and once you change the actual stories that were being told, you will lose the audience, because it is not the thing they loved, even if it looks like the thing they loved. We saw that when Disney bought Star Wars and released the sequel trilogy. It can look like Star Wars all at once, but it is not Star Wars because it doesn't feel like Star Wars. Look at Star Trek. Well, actually, that's a bit more complicated because Star Trek doesn't even look like Star Trek. It looks like one of those parody shows that would make fun of Star Trek that didn't have the rights to use any of the designs So it came up with something that looked similar but different. But it still looks close enough that they thought people would go into it just because it was Star Trek. And you'll notice that there aren't that many new things that are being released. Whether or not, for instance, you agree with what happened with Ruby over at Rooster Teeth, and a lot of people think it became a bloody mess, it was at least original. Whether or not you liked Steven Universe, it was at least original. And the same thing can be said about a lot of other things. And I'm not saying you can't have valid criticisms for those. But a lot of the things they're doing now are just revivals of old things. Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power on Amazon, for example. Star Trek and Star Wars, we've already mentioned. X-Men 97, we've mentioned. But the people who are making these things really just want to write their political agendas into stories, and they can't create on their own, so they use someone else's, and besides, this is popular. They're basically trying to subvert and corrupt existing things to suit their agenda. But it's not all their fault, because as a culture we've gotten to this sort of stagnant area where we're doing nothing but looking at what came before. Nothing is being truly created, except, of course, AI. But AI itself is a good analogy to this, and perhaps even a symptom of it, since we have yet to create an AI that is truly creative. All it does is mash up pre-existing ideas. Granted, a great deal of human creativity does the same thing, but there's something different when a human does it. With the machine, it is all too mechanical, at least for now. And I think that's actually a problem. It's like we're trying too hard to hold on to those things of the past. On the other hand, I don't think the radical solution of letting go of the past and letting it die, kill it if we have to borrow from the least popular Star Wars movie in the main trilogies, the trilogy of trilogies. Because doing that, we lose our culture and our identity. I do think that some things need to be left alone after they've run their course. We can still celebrate them, we can remember them, we can revisit them, but we need to leave them alone, or at least leave them alone for a while. And at the same time, I do think that while continuing certain things or remaking certain things every once in a while isn't bad, it can even be healthy, and holding on to certain cultural elements, bringing them up periodically can be healthy, giving us grounding and points of reference. I do think that we overdo it nowadays, considering in the past it used to be something like 75 to 80% of things were original. And in this context, I'm not saying necessarily truly original. It could still be derivative, but it was a new thing. And only a handful of things were continuations or remakes. Something like Star Trek: The Next Generation was rare, in that most of the television shows that came out in 1987 were not continuations of previous television series or previous concepts. I'm not saying none were, but most weren't. With Star Trek: The Next Generation, it was a continuation of Star Trek. This was an unusual thing back then, and it worked, because the people who made Star Trek: The Next Generation still included Gene Roddenberry, it still included various people who worked on the original series, and the ones they brought in really loved and knew the material, and learned directly from the masters who created it before them. And as such, while some people were worried before it came out that it would ruin the legacy of Star Trek or it wouldn't be good, and a lot of times when they bring things back in revivals, they're not, it defied that expectation, that trend toward mediocrity, and became an excellent show in its own right, standing on its own, not just as a Star Trek show, but as its own show. While, yes, it's true the name itself says The Next Generation, it's obviously a continuation of something else, it didn't feel like it needed that. You could watch Star Trek The Next Generation without ever having heard of the original series and still understand the stories, the plots, and the world, and get involved in it. And then, of course, that kicked off the golden age of Star Trek with Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and, of course, Enterprise. But that's rare. And, of course, it continued after Enterprise to, well, Abrams and his lot. And I'm one of those people who doesn't hate Abrams movies. I don't love them, but I don't hate them. Because they were set in an alternate timeline, and while they are popcorn fluff, they're an occasion movie. I realize Star Trek is supposed to be better than that, but Star Trek did have its occasional light-hearted comedic episodes, like The Trouble with Tribbles famously, or A Piece of the Action, where they were on a gangster planet. Or Shore Leave. Or Spock's Brain. Or even in The Next Generation, you had the episode where Q came and took them to Sherwood Forest. You had Manhunt, which most people don't like that episode, but it was an episode that was lighthearted and comedic, where Lwaxana Troi, Diana Troy's mother, was looking for a man. At the same time, Star Trek, while it's true it is best when it is philosophical, can endure that sort of lightheartedness. And I didn't really mind the movies, because the movies, they were a fun remembrance of Star Trek, a celebration. It's like going to Star Trek's house for a party. It may not be the deepest conversation you had. They may be playing recordings of music very loudly in the corner while people are drinking and dancing and joking about, and it may not be the deepest, most meaningful time you've had with Star Trek. But it didn't have to be. It didn't damage anything. Not like Discovery would. Not like Strange New Worlds does, especially with the Gorn. Not like Picard did with Picard and Q and everyone else. And therein lies the problem. You see, I think there's more than one problem, really. There's the fact that people can't create new things today, and the fact that they are corrupting what already exists. And I think they're related and have ultimately the same, or at least related causes. But I'm not arguing that it is wrong to continue or to add to old works or to bring them back. But I do think that we've lost a generative spirit in our society. We don't produce new things. We just wallow in the old, and to a large extent, because we're not growing, we are decaying. And as we decay as a culture, that is reflected in our art, which decays. And I think that generation, creation, is necessary for our society. That's why we have children, although fewer of us do now. I never had a chance to. Perhaps one day. But I do fear for our society. And I'm thinking about this because when you go to sci-fi conventions, most of the costumes are, these days, of older things. And even when they are of newer things, they're of newer things that are themselves based on older things. Like if I go to a convention, I expect Darth Vader and Stormtroopers, and the Stormtroopers are usually the original trilogy Star Wars Stormtroopers. Sometimes a clone trooper from the prequels. Rarely, although you do see them, will you see a sequel trilogy Stormtrooper, or a Kylo Ren instead of a Darth Vader. You see them, but they're not as common. But even so, when you see them, it's still Star Wars. you don't see as much new or exciting. Unless, of course, someone's created their own costume or own character to go in. And that is a shame, I think. And I do think it affects more than just our entertainment. Our entertainment, while not the most vital aspect of a society, is still important and reflects the psychology of the culture. We live in a time, though, when the major purveyors of the things we watch are discordant with their audience to a large degree. That's not to say no one in the audience likes what they do, but most don't, and people are walking away. But it still reflects what the powers that be want us to be like, and it still reflects to some extent what we are even in resistance. Because when you look at people complaining, they still want the old, and we're not creating the new. We're not coming up with new things, but we're also not respecting the past. We're just holding on to the past as it rots away from us. And I do worry about society for that reason. I worry that we may face greater problems if we hold too tightly to the past, that we may fall short of that goal of striving for a better world. We may just hold on to these older things that we don't even do anything new with. We don't even keep them alive. We really just hold on to them as they decay. And as they decay, we decay. And to that end, I think we need to call upon something even older than most of the entertainment we've been talking about. We need to call upon God. Yes, I know people are going to say that I'm being hypocritical, especially if I bring up the Bible, but I'm not. Again, I'm not saying looking at that which is old is bad. What I'm saying is we need to do more than just hold what is old, even when it is dead. We need to give life to that old tradition. We need to create new things, and we need to anchor those old new things in the old things, but we need to give life to both. And it is through generation that we give life. It is through the generation of that new that we can make the old have meaning. It is through generating new things with the old that we can give it new life. It is by being willing to understand our past but build a future that we give life to ourselves, and yet we don't see that in our culture. We see us holding on. For want of a better term, and to use Pope Francis's terms, to dead tradition. I don't agree with Pope Francis. I believe the traditional Mass, the Tridentine Mass, is beautiful and should be preserved. And I wouldn't mind if they simply translated the Tridentine Mass into English, or whatever other local language you're using. But I don't have a problem with it being in Latin, and I don't have a problem with it being in the vernacular. The Novus Ordo, though, is very obviously a failure at keeping people invested, and I don't know why they insist upon it. Well, I do, but it's a topic for a different video. I actually have more sympathies with traditional Catholicism than with more liberal reforms. But when I talk about holding on to dead tradition, I'm not talking about holding on to tradition. Tradition can be alive. It can be lively while being alive. But tradition is dead if all it is tradition for its own sake, and if we do nothing with it and simply hold it. We must give it life. We are the living. And we must live to be the living, to be the change we wish to be. And we can impugn those old traditions with life. But too many of us hold on to them and do not imbue them with life. We merely hold on to them until they become nothing but hollowed out forms of what they were. The same with our television programming. And the same with all aspects of our life where we've become desensitized, atomized as a society. People have a loneliness crisis with no friends, for instance. People live for nothing but hedonistic pleasures, and they're not even great hedonistic pleasures, just vegging out on a couch watching television, listening to music without much concern. And again, I'm not saying watching television is bad. I'm not saying listening to music is bad. I'm not saying listening to videos on the internet are bad. I'm obviously making such a video. I am, however, saying that people should want more than just this. And yet, we don't. The fault lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. And I do think we need to strive not just to hold on to old things we remember, but to press on to create the new and to appreciate the old. I shall take my leave of you now. I think I have said enough. Thank you. God bless. And goodbye.